research in that. What would your definition of a habitat tree be? Do you have a particular view on what constitutes a habitat tree?
Well, I guess you've got to consider habitat trees, I guess, as being ones that are currently usable by different fauna, so whether it be birds or mammals or even reptiles. But there are also the trees which have the potential to become habitat trees. So I guess habitat trees largely are considered trees that provide some form of shelter or breeding sites for birds, bats.
Going along with the idea that I think most of us would accept that the larger, older trees have the bigger or better hollows, you could probably define a habitat tree in the context of what we were just talking about as a breeding site as almost any tree that had a hollow.
Yeah, not all hollows, that's largely true, but not all hollows are necessarily useful to all species. Species are often quite specific as to how big the hollow is, whether the hollow goes down or up and various things, but any tree with a hollow in it has a high probability of being used by some species or other. So it's pretty important. I guess the research that's been done on hollows basically shows that eucalypts take at least 150 years before they start getting substantial number of hollows in them. So trees with hollows in them are one of the hardest habitat elements in a forest to actually replace because they take such a long time to develop. The process of hollow formation in eucalypts is one where you basically start off with some sort of injury, so whether it's a branch breaking off, whether it's been struck by lightning, whether it's been an injury caused by fire, creates a damage point. That damage point allows fungus to get in, and often then is followed up by termites getting in that creates the hollow. It's a time process, and it takes a long time for all of those sequence of events to take place. And then once it's formed, it can be useful then for perhaps several decades. But hollows in live trees tend to be of more value in a sense than hollows in dead trees, because dead trees have a relatively short lifespan usually. They'll continue to decay and fall over. So trees with live trees with hollows in them are probably a more valuable element in the forest environment.
Right. Okay, well that was the reason for the interest there is that there's been different views put forward as to the extent of damage to habitat trees in this burn, with less than half a dozen trees being put forward as being destroyed, whereas Peter's viewed 38 habitat trees on fire from his vehicle the other night, which is one of the things that we want to try and look at today, because while we're not looking to blame anybody for the fact that some of these are gone, the issue we wish to highlight is that with the current fuel levels there's some difficulty in stopping some of these habitat trees from lighting up, and we have a great concern, which has been expressed all the way through this VEAC investigation, that an increase in fuel loads in the forest is just going to make the forest manager's job so much harder to manage the forest, taking into account environmental values but also public safety in the forest and the adjoining properties.
Yeah, well it's true, there are two elements I guess to protecting the habitat trees. One is that if you're in a period of drought or severe stress, then the chances of those habitat trees lighting up is going to be much greater because they're so much drier, both internally and around them. But also, as you say, if there's actually more fuel around them as well, that means that the fire is applied for a longer period of time. So again, the chance of igniting them is greater. So in a drought, the chance of habitat trees being set alight or being damaged is much greater. And having a long period since the last fire means that you're likely to have a greater accumulation of fuel on the ground, particularly the woody material, which would again apply more pressure, more heat to the trees that would increase the chance of them catching alight. So yeah, there are things you can do to help limit that, which might be raking around the trees to remove the local accumulation of litter, or using foam to actually create a bit of a moisture differential that wasn't there. But that all depends on how accessible those areas are and so on. But I guess the more natural process would be to have fire probably more regularly but lower intensity, so that the trees don't catch alight, or burn at a time when there's more moisture in the environment, where less of the fuel becomes available, or the hollows themselves that have more moisture in them from the rain and the seasonal conditions.
So given that obviously the fuel level is a primary factor in the intensity of the fire and the damage that results from that, what part has grazing in the forest got to play in that scenario?
Yeah, grazing plays a couple of roles in modifying the fuels. I guess one is that you've got the dead leaf bark material on the ground. Grazing will tend to trample it a bit, so it changes the structure of the fuel to make it a bit less flashy, so that it's less flame height, if you like, so it calms the fire to some extent. And grazing also has an impact on sort of the grassy herbaceous material, because it gets eaten and broken down. So the grassy material, what we call a near surface fuel, adds considerably to the flame height and the spread rate of the fire. So grazing both modifies the structure of the dead material and modifies the structure effectively of the near surface fuel. So that significantly reduces the fire characteristics, the fire intensity when it goes through an area that's been affected by grazing. But it depends on how intensive the grazing is too, whether or not that has a big impact across the area, or whether it's almost negligible.
Right, okay. And so the thing that was of interest there was the intensity and the speed of the fire from the grassy material, and that would be the primary fodder one would imagine that the cutter would remove. That would probably be the first thing that they would remove, or seek to remove, would be the grassy material.
Yeah, sure. And as I say, removing the fodder, the grassy material, but they're also helping compact some of the other fine material that's around too, just help break that down and keep it close to the surface. So it's not removing it, but it's actually changing the structure to modify the fire behaviour as well. So even though they're not eating it, by just moving it around,